The oil-stained floor of Miller's Auto Repair was slick with rainwater and engine grease when the hydraulic lift gave out and nearly crushed Hank Whitaker's hand. It crashed down with a metallic snarl, missing him by inches. The impact shook the ground beneath his boots. One more inch, and his left arm would have been shattered into more pieces than his bank account. Jesus! He gasped, stumbling back, heart hammering. He stood there, grease-slick rag in hand, his breath fogging in the cold Alabama air. The ancient Chevy Silverado on the lift groaned, wobbling, like it knew exactly how close it came to breaking the last working mechanic in the county. A voice echoed from the garage doorway. "You all right, Whitaker?" It was Randy, the shop owner. "Yeah," Hank muttered. "Just another Monday." It was actually Thursday, but in Hank Whitaker's life, every day felt like Monday. His hands shook slightly as he wiped them off. Not from fear, from exhaustion. It was 6:15 a.m. He'd already worked 6 hours at the repair shop. Before that, he'd pulled a late shift bussing tables at Claiborne's Diner. Sleeping wasn't something he did much of anymore. He caught fragments of rest between shifts, like a guy trying to catch fireflies with a hole in his net. Outside, rain fell in slow sheets, turning the cracked parking lot into a mirror of headlights, neon signs, and puddled sky. Somewhere inside, his phone buzzed. He didn't check it. He didn't have to. He knew exactly who it was. Rent reminder 3 days overdue. Water bill reminder, final notice. Bank account $47.12. The only text he hadn't seen before was at the bottom. One from Caleb, his 13-year-old son. Dad Mason took the last cereal. Rosie's crying again. Can we get pancakes tonight? Also, my teacher asked why I keep falling asleep in class. He read it twice. Not because he didn't understand, but because he did. The rain thinned. He could see his reflection in the garage glass. Early 40s, but his face looked older. Too many shift nights. Too many you don't qualify for that loan letters. Too many. I'm sorry about your loss. Looks after Amy died. He placed his hand on the hood of the truck, steadying himself. Why does surviving have to feel so much like breaking? The sun peeked through clouds as he left the shop and got into his sputtering Honda Odyssey that coughed like it had bronchitis and arthritis at the same time. He tossed his tool bag in the back next to booster seats and mismatched backpacks. He sat there for a second, engine off, just listening to the rain. Then he said it, out loud, to no one. Or maybe to God. Or maybe to Amy. You ever get the feeling the world's just waiting for you to give up? No. Answer. Just the sound of a loose windshield wiper squeaking against glass. He started the engine. Their rented townhome was tired, 2 bedrooms crammed with 4 kids, bunk beds, stacks of hand-me-down clothes in laundry baskets because there weren't enough drawers. Bills in a drawer Hank didn't like opening. A photo of Amy on the fridge. Inside chaos was already awake. Mason, age 8, was reassembling a broken toaster using Legos. Rosie, age 5, was crying because her cereal floated too much. Sophie, age 11, was braiding Rosie's hair like she'd been doing it all her life. And Caleb, his oldest, was washing dishes wearing a shirt 2 sizes too small, trying too hard to be grown. "Hey," Caleb said without turning. "We're out of milk and toilet paper." And the internet got cut off again. Hank gave a slow, numb nod. "Okay, I'll fix it." Rosie climbed into his lap without asking, head resting against his chest, thumb in her mouth. She didn't care about bills, or broken lifts, or overdue rent. She just knew Dad felt like downpour rain. He held her, just breathing, He thought about his life. A man working 3 jobs, hiding overdue bills in glove compartments, telling his kids they were having indoor camping night when the power got shut off. Was this survival or slow drowning, Dad? Caleb said, drying his hands on a towel. You got mail. Important looking. Hank looked down. Thick envelope, heavy cream-colored paper. Return address, Morrison and Riley Attorneys at Law, Blue Ridge, North Carolina. He frowned. He'd never heard of them. Inside a single typed page. Dear Mr. Henry Whitaker, we regret to inform you of the passing of Howard Brennan, your great-uncle who named you sole heir to his estate, the Marigold Hotel, located in Blue Ridge Mountains, North Carolina. Please contact us within 14 days to arrange transfer of ownership. He blinked, read it again, and again. Then Caleb looked up and said, We have an Uncle Hank had no answer. He barely had words, only questions. Why him? Was this real? What kind of hotel? Was it some old barn-sized building in the woods? Was it even standing? But one thought spun louder than any other. Why would someone I never met leave me anything? He lifted his eyes. For the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel tired. He felt something else. Something like curiosity, fear, hope. The kids were waiting for him to say something. Finally, he exhaled. We're going to North Carolina. The road narrowed as it climbed winding into the North Carolina mountains, like a ribbon knotted through mist and trees. Towering pines lined both sides of the 2-lane highway, their tips lost in low gray clouds. The Whitaker family van grumbled up the incline wheels, chewing on gravel, shocks squeaking with every pothole. Inside the cabin, the kids were bouncing between awe and antsy. Are we almost there? Mason asked for the 6th time, forehead pressed to the window. No, Sophie said flatly, flipping a page in her tattered library book. You asked 6 minutes ago, and we were 40 minutes away then. I just meant like, emotionally closer. Caleb smirked from the passenger seat. That doesn't even make sense, bro. Mason shrugged. Neither does Dad owning a haunted hotel. In the rearview mirror, Hank cracked a smile. I don't own anything yet, bud. We're just going to check it out. That's all. That's what people say right before they move into cursed places, Mason said seriously. I saw it in a movie. Hank didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the road, hands firm on the wheel. The thought had crossed his mind too, not the haunted part, but the cursed part, because nothing good ever fell into your lap without a catch. Not in his life. It had been 2 days since the letter. 2 days of explaining to the kids they'd be missing school for a few days. 2 days of calling in every favor he had just to borrow gas money. 2 days of second-guessing himself every time he looked at the creased page from Morrison and Riley. But here they were. Somewhere in the middle of nowhere, chasing the ghost of a man he never met. A man who for some reason had left him a hotel. The sign appeared suddenly through the fog, hand-painted wooden faded, Welcome to Blue Ridge Falls, Pop. 319. Maybe Sophie read it aloud and gave her verdict. Seems alive. It's probably cute, Caleb offered. Like those tourist towns with apple festivals and Christmas lights in October. They reached the edge of town and passed a general store with a single dusty window. Then a diner boarded up. A gas station with 2 working pumps and a closed sign. No Christmas lights. No festivals. No people. Just stillness and rot. Sophie leaned forward, pressing her nose to the glass. Maybe the ghosts up here are friendlier than the ones we left behind. Hank glanced at her. Her tone hadn't been joking, and she wasn't looking at him, just out at the road, quiet and pensive, in a way that reminded him too much of her mother. Maybe he said softly. The road out of town veered sharply to the right, then climbed again. Gravel turned to dirt. The trees thickened the canopy, swallowing sunlight, until everything was a shadowy green tunnel. The GPS had died 30 minutes ago. Now it was just road signs, old, rusted, and half covered in moss. "Is this even real?" Caleb muttered. "Or are we in a horror movie?" "Shut up," Sophie whispered, eyes wide. "Don't say that when we can't turn around." But then, without warning, the trees broke. And there it was. The Marigold Hotel. It sat in a hollow clearing at the end of the road, like something that had grown out of the mountain itself. 3 stories high, with a wraparound porch sagging in places, paint peeled like sunburned skin, windows dark and cracked, vines curled up the walls and tangled along the gables. The front tower had lost its weather vane. The roof slumped like an old man's shoulders. Rosie let out a quiet "wow" from the back seat. No one else said anything. Not for a long time. Then Caleb said what they were all thinking. "We can't live here." "We're not," Hank said. "We're just looking." But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. He put the car in park. The van hissed and clicked like it was grateful to stop. They stepped out one by one, boots and sneakers crunching against gravel, then weeds. The air smelled like moss and rain and old wood. The only sound was the wind threading through the trees. Mason kicked at a pine cone. "It looks like a monster." "It looks like a memory," Sophie said, her voice distant again. Hank didn't respond. He walked toward the porch slowly. Each step made the front of the house feel taller, heavier, more real. The kind of real that pressed on your chest. The front stairs groaned under his weight. Rosie grabbed his hand tightly. The door was made of dark oak with stained glass panels shattered and patched over. He reached for the handle, half expecting it to fall off in his hand. It didn't. It turned. The door swung open with a sound like a sigh. Inside, dust. Silence. Shadows stretched long across the wooden floors. A chandelier hung from the foyer ceiling, one bulb flickering dimly from some miracle of forgotten wiring. Faded wallpaper peeled in long curls. Cobwebs bridged every corner. A staircase curled upward, grand and crumbling. "I think the Addams family lived here," Mason whispered. Sophie smirked. "We should have brought garlic." "That's for vampires," Caleb said. "Not ghosts." "Okay then, what do ghosts hate?" "Taxes," Hank muttered. The kids laughed a little too loud. They moved cautiously through the first floor, what had been the lobby, the dining room, a wide lounge with furniture draped in sheets. Sophie peeked under one and found a velvet armchair still intact. Caleb pointed to the front desk. "What's that?" Behind the counter, a brass key hung on a hook. Dusty, labeled Suite 7. Hank's fingers closed around it. It was heavier than it looked. He turned to the kids. "Let's see what we've got." They climbed the stairs. Boards creaked but held. The second floor stretched in a long corridor lined with doors. Hank found Suite 7 at the end, larger than the others with its own transom window. He unlocked the door. It opened easily. Inside, a sitting room, a bedroom, a bathroom with a clawfoot tub. Sheets still on the furniture, but the dust here was thinner. Someone had cared, or planned to. On the desk, an envelope, yellowed, addressed to Henry Whitaker. He opened it. Dear Hank, if you're reading this, then I was right. You came. I know you have questions. I know you're tired. But I hope deeply, hope you see this not as a burden, but as a door. The marigold is more than it looks. So are you. We don't get to choose our pain, but we get to choose what we do with it. Welcome home. Howard Brennan. Hank stared at the letter until the words blurred. Then Rosie tugged on his sleeve. Daddy, are we staying here, Hank? Exhaled slowly. The air smelled like old cedar and rain-soaked books. I don't know, he said, but something deep inside stirred. Because the truth was he wanted to, even if it made no sense, even if it was probably insane, even if he had no idea what came next. He looked out the cracked window down toward the trees and saw it again, the same fog curling low across the ground, like breath. Something about this place wasn't finished, and neither was he. Down the hallway, unseen, a door creaked open. Tomorrow they would start exploring, and the past would start to wake up. The sun broke through the mountain mist like a promise no one trusted. Thin light filtered through cracked panes of Suite 7, illuminating dust in golden streaks. The room smelled like old wood, distant mildew, and something older like stories sealed behind wallpaper. Hank Whitaker sat on the edge of the bed, bare feet on cold floorboards, rereading the letter for the 4th time. Howard Brennan's words lingered in his head. We don't get to choose our pain, but we get to choose what we do with it. He didn't know the man, but somehow the words felt personal. A knock came at the door. Caleb peeked in, still in yesterday's hoodie, hair messy from sleep. You good? Hank looked up, folding the letter. Yeah. You guys up? Rosie's trying to brush her teeth with hand sanitizer. Mason's looking for ghosts. Sophie's reorganizing the books in the lobby by color, which she says is a coping mechanism. Hank chuckled dryly. Sounds healthy. Caleb stepped in. What now? Hank looked around the room again. Noticed for the first time that the dust here was minimal compared to the rest of the hotel. Furniture covered with clean white sheets. No signs of intrusion. It had been maintained, maybe not recently, but with intention. Someone had kept this room ready. He stood stretching his back. We figure out why he left this to us. Downstairs, the kids were already scattered. Sophie was in fact sorting books, titles like The Carolina Registry 1912 and Blue Ridge Mineral Riches Volume 2. Mason had tied a belt around his head like a ghost-hunting bandana and was poking at a vent with a plastic fork. Rosie wandered with a flashlight 3 times her size. Caleb walked behind the front desk, rifling through drawers. Hey, Dad. Hank joined him, leaning over. Look at this, Caleb said, pulling out a thin wooden drawer lined with felt. A small brass key sat alone in the corner, glinting faintly. There was no tag, but next to it was a scrap of paper, faded ink, curling edges. On it, in the same handwriting as the letter upstairs, Suite 7, begin here. Hank picked up the key. It felt warm, as if it had been waiting. They returned to the room. The kids followed, curiosity humming around them. Hank slid the key into the desk drawer beneath the vanity. The lock clicked with a soft finality. Inside was a smaller envelope. This time, no name. Just a single line scrawled across the front: the truth is buried with the fire. Find the smoke. He read it aloud. Is that like a poem? Mason asked, chewing on a gummy worm he'd somehow found. Sophie leaned closer. No. It's a clue. Hank looked at the key again, then at the room, everything intact, except one thing: the painting above the fireplace was missing. The dust outline was clear. Someone had removed it. Recently, Caleb Hank said. Grab a flashlight. They searched Suite 7 thoroughly, closets, drawers behind the bathroom mirror. Then Sophie pointed to the wardrobe. This doesn't line up with the floorboards. Look. Hank ran his hand along the inside. There at the back was a seam, a faint outline in the wood, a false panel. It took 2 minutes and a pocket knife, but the panel gave way with a pop. Behind it, a stack of yellowed newspaper clippings and a sealed manila envelope. On the front, Marigold Fire, 1973. He opened it slowly. Inside were black and white photos, blurry and smudged. The hotel in flames. Fire trucks parked along the road. Smoke billowing into the night. And a list, names of guests who had checked in the night of the fire. Most were crossed out. But 2 names weren't. Howard Brennan, Loretta Jensen. Who's Loretta? Sophie asked. Hank didn't answer right away. He turned the paper over. On the back was a scribbled note, Loretta knows. She stayed when the others ran. He sat back on his heels. Okay, he said. I think we need to find this woman. Maybe she's dead, Mason said bluntly. Maybe, Hank replied. But maybe she's not. Caleb held up one of the newspaper clippings. This article says she was the head chef, lived in Blue Ridge. We could ask around. Hank looked toward the window. The fog was beginning to lift. All right, he said. Let's go into town. See who remembers. Blue Ridge Falls felt more alive by late morning, but only barely. A few locals leaned against the porch railings of the general store. A truck rolled by with bales of hay in the back. The town had a stillness that didn't feel peaceful, more like everyone was holding their breath. They parked near the post office where an older man in a rocking chair looked up as they approached. Can I help you? He asked, squinting under a faded cap. We're looking for someone, Hank said. Name's Loretta Jensen. Used to work at the Marigold. The man blinked once, twice, then leaned forward slowly. You from that place? He asked. Hank nodded. The man studied him for a long time. Then he pointed down the road. Last house before the creek. Yellow siding. White fence. She don't answer the door much, but she's still there. Thanks, Hank said. The man didn't reply. They drove to the edge of town. The yellow house sat quietly under a willow tree, the porch swing still, though there was no wind. A ceramic rooster guarded the mailbox. Hank knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Footsteps creaked inside. Then silence. Finally, the door opened a crack. A woman in her 70s peered out, steel gray hair, sharp cheekbones, eyes like glass marbles. I don't talk to reporters, she said flatly. I'm not one, Hank replied. I'm Howard's great-nephew. She stared. Something shifted behind her expression. She opened the door another inch. You came, she whispered. After all this time, someone finally came. Hank held up the folder. He left this and your name. Loretta stepped back and opened the door wide. Well, she said, then I guess it's time someone told you what really happened in that hotel. Hank looked over his shoulder at Caleb, who gave a small nod. He stepped inside. Back at the hotel, unseen from the road, something stirred. A curtain moved in Suite 7, though no window was open. Down in the lobby beneath the floorboards came a creak, like something shifting under weight, or waking up. Tomorrow the secrets would begin to surface, because the past hadn't died in that fire. It had been waiting. The silence in Loretta Jensen's living room was thick, not empty. It was the kind of silence that grew between old walls aged by memory, not time. The only sound came from the steady tick of a grandfather clock near the door, its pendulum swinging like a tired heartbeat. Loretta sat across from Hank in a faded armchair, hands folded in her lap, eyes scanning him like a detective in a worn-down trench coat. Her house was cluttered, but clean books, knitted throws, the faint smell of lemons and mothballs. "I haven't said that name out loud in 20 years, she began, voice low, nearly a growl. "The Marigold." Hank leaned forward. "You were there, that night." "The fire." "I was," she said. "And I stayed when others ran, because I knew what they were trying to hide." She reached beside her and pulled out a weathered photo album. Inside, black and white pictures of the hotel in its prime. Staff in crisp uniforms. Guests laughing under chandeliers. Then, toward the end, burnt edges, smoke-stained shots of the aftermath. "It wasn't an accident," she said, tapping the last photo. "The fire. Everyone assumed it was old wiring or the kitchen stove. But it was deliberate. Someone wanted to erase something. Or someone." Hank swallowed. "Howard." No, Loretta said. "Howard was the target. But he survived. Barely." She got up slowly, her bones creaking in protest, and crossed the room. From a drawer, she pulled out a sealed envelope and handed it to Hank. "He gave this to me a week before the fire. Told me if anything happened, I was to keep it safe. He thought someone in the family was planning something." Hank opened the envelope. Inside were schematics of the hotel original blueprints. But something stood out. There was a hand-drawn addition, a room beneath the foundation. No label. Just a faint outline and a single-word vault. "I've never seen that room," Hank said. "And we've walked almost every floor." "That's because it's not on any of the modern plans," Loretta replied. "It's older, original to the first structure. Howard believed something was hidden down there, something tied to the Brennan family legacy. He never found it. But maybe you can." Hank folded the papers and slipped them into his jacket. "Loretta," he said, eyes searching hers. "Why me? Why would he leave this place to someone he never met?" She looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Because you're the only one who didn't ask." The fog was heavier by the time Hank returned to the hotel. The kids had passed the afternoon exploring more rooms. Caleb had found a record player that still worked, and now soft jazz drifted faintly through the empty hallways. Sophie met Hank on the stairs, her arms full of old guest ledgers. "We've been organizing the front desk," she said proudly. "You wouldn't believe how many people stayed here in the 50s. Movie stars, politicians, someone named E. Presley, but it might have been a prank." He smiled, distracted, then asked, "Where's Caleb?" "In the dining hall," she said. "He found a trap door." Hank blinked. "A what?" They hurried down to the dining room, which still smelled faintly of ash and charred wood. Caleb stood over a loose floorboard near the bar, flashlight in hand. "It was wedged shut with nails," Caleb said, "but the wood's rotted out underneath. I think it leads somewhere." Hank knelt beside him, pulling out Loretta's blueprint. The trapdoor aligned perfectly with the drawing. The vault. It was real. "Get Mason and Rosie," Hank told Sophie. "We're not going down until everyone's upstairs." 5 minutes later, the younger kids were settled with books and snacks in Suite 7. Hank returned, crowbar in hand. Caleb stood beside him, eyes wide with something between fear and adrenaline. "You ready?" Hank asked. Caleb nodded. The trapdoor groaned as it lifted, coughing up decades of dust. A narrow staircase descended into darkness, the air below colder than the mountain outside. Hank clicked on his flashlight. Stay close. They stepped down into the unknown. The basement felt more like a cave than part of the hotel. Stone walls, dripping pipes, earth beneath their boots. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the air became, thick with damp and silence. At the bottom of the steps stood a heavy metal door. It was bolted, welded shut at some point. On its surface, scratched into the rust, were the words, "Some things stay buried for a reason." "Dad," Caleb whispered, running his fingers over the words. Hank examined the welding. Old, sloppy. Someone had sealed this in a hurry without planning. Maybe during the fire. Maybe right before. He turned to Caleb. "This is the room from the drawing. The vault." "What's inside?" the boy asked. "I don't know," Hank said. "But your great-uncle thought it mattered." They stared at the sealed door in silence. Then Caleb said, voice tight, "Whatever happened here never left these walls." The words hung in the air, heavier than the stone around them. They returned upstairs without opening the vault. Not yet. Hank needed tools and time. The past had waited this long, it could wait one more night. By dusk, the hotel had turned quiet again. Rosie was asleep on the couch, Sophie reading beside her. Mason was drawing ghost traps in crayon. Caleb sat with Hank by the fireplace, staring into the cold grate. "Do you believe in curses?" Caleb asked. Hank shook his head. "Not curses, but I believe in consequences." Caleb nodded, thoughtful. "If we find out the truth, will it change anything?" "Yeah," Hank said. "It changes everything." Later, after the kids were in bed, Hank sat alone in the lobby, the blueprint in his lap, the fireless hearth at his back. He stared at the drawing of the vault and the words scrawled beside it in Howard's handwriting. Legacy. He didn't know what was behind that door. But he knew now the fire wasn't just about burning down a building. It was about hiding something powerful. Something that could either save his family or destroy what was left of it. Tomorrow he'd open it, one way or another. Because the past wasn't buried. It was locked in a room. And he finally had the key. The wind had teeth that morning. Cold rolled down the mountainside in sharp waves, curling through broken shutters and rattling the windows of the Marigold. It was early, still gray, but Hank was already downstairs in the dining hall toolbox, at his feet, eyes fixed on the trapdoor. He hadn't slept. His body had begged for rest, but his mind was a hammer. That door, sealed, rusted, screaming to be opened, had burrowed into his thoughts like a nail in the wood of his chest. There was something down there. Something left unfinished by fire, family, or fear. And Howard Brennan had trusted him to find it. Caleb entered quietly, hands in his hoodie pockets, face pale in the early light. "You sure about this?" Hank looked up, his voice hoarse from a night of silence. "Truth doesn't hide, it waits." That was all he said. Together they pried open the trap door again. The stairs groaned like they remembered the weight. Dust floated in the flashlight beams, like breath made visible. At the bottom, the vault door waited. Welded seams, rust along the hinges. The old warning still scratched across its surface, "Some things stay buried for a reason." Hank unzipped his bag and pulled out a battery-powered angle grinder. He handed Caleb the flashlight and slipped on his goggles. The grinder shrieked when it met metal sparks flying in a scatter of orange. The hotel seemed to flinch at the sound. Upstairs, footsteps stirred, but Hank kept going. Steel gave way in strips, years of silence peeled back with every hiss. After 20 minutes, the last weld popped. The door creaked forward inch by inch until darkness spilled into the corridor like ink. Hank stepped inside first. The vault was a long, narrow chamber, stone-lined, low-ceilinged, colder than the rest of the basement. On one wall sat a built-in shelf, dusty but undisturbed. On it a wooden box, a cloth-bound ledger, and an envelope yellowed to the color of old teeth. Hank reached for the envelope. Inside, a letter in Howard's handwriting. "Hank, if you've found this, then I'm gone and you're braver than I ever was. Everything in this room was never meant to see light again. But the truth has weight. It doesn't rot. It waits." Inside the ledger, you'll find records from 1952 to 1973, names, transactions, and something more. Money that never made it into the family books. Secrets that didn't belong to me, but became mine the day I said nothing. If you want to walk away, I won't blame you. But if you open that box, you'll be holding the bloodline by the throat. Choose carefully. H.B. Hank read it twice. Then he opened the ledger. Pages of names, dates, bank accounts, payoffs, code words scribbled in margins. He didn't understand all of it, but the amounts were staggering. Offshore accounts, shell corporations, disbursements to people marked only by initials. Some of those initials matched names Hank had seen on the walls upstairs. Brennan family members. This wasn't just money. It was a map of manipulation. He turned to the box. It wasn't locked, just latched. He opened it. Inside was a smaller bundle birth certificates, including his own, his mother's, and a third, Howard Brennan Jr., born 3 years before Hank, deceased at age 5. Hank's hands trembled. A newspaper clipping folded and tucked in the corner showed a headline from 1960, Brennan family tragedy. Young heir dies in river accident. The photo was grainy, but the boy looked like Caleb. He turned to the last item, a child's drawing in crayon. A crooked house, a stick figure, Uncle Howard written in red. It was signed Hank, age 9. His throat tightened. He remembered it. Barely. A letter his mom had made him write to thank her cousin for a box of old toys. He'd forgotten. Or tried to. That one small moment, that forgotten letter, had tethered him to this legacy. Howard hadn't chosen him out of obligation. He'd chosen him because Hank had remembered he existed. Behind him, Caleb's voice cracked the silence. "Dad." Hank turned, eyes burning. "What is this?" Caleb asked, looking at the papers. Hank swallowed. "It's the reason they set the fire. To hide all this. This money. These secrets. Howard kept it hidden so no one could use it again." Caleb pointed to a page. "These names. Are they still alive?" Some, Hank said. "I think some are very much alive." He closed the box slowly. "We take this upstairs," he said. "We keep it safe." Back in the lobby, the morning sun was warming the broken windows. Sophie was flipping pancakes in a cast-iron skillet she'd found in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled up like she'd lived here for years. Rosie hummed on the floor, brushing a doll's hair. Mason had somehow made a cardboard sign that said, "Marigold Inn, enter if you dare," and taped it to the front desk. Hank walked past them, the box in his arms, his mind in another century. They spent the afternoon sorting files. Sophie helped cross-reference names with town records. Caleb drew a diagram of the original ownership tree. Mason made snacks and wrote confidential on everything. Rosie provided moral support. By late afternoon, there was a knock on the front door. A tall figure stood outside, a man in his 50s, dark coat, pressed slacks, eyes that didn't blink enough. Hank opened the door cautiously. "Mr. Whitaker," the man asked. "That's me. I'm Pastor Elijah Bell. I knew Howard Brennan. We spoke near the end." Hank nodded slowly. "Come in." Elijah stepped inside and looked around the lobby, eyes sweeping the ceiling. "Still standing," he murmured. "This place was built on secrets and prayers. I'm surprised it hasn't sunk." He turned to Hank. "You found it, didn't you? The vault." Hank didn't answer. Elijah gave a faint smile. "I don't want anything. I'm just here to tell you one thing." He leaned closer, voice lowered. "You're holding something people would burn down the world to bury." Hank met his eyes. "I think I'm starting to understand that." The pastor nodded. "Then you also know they'll be coming." He handed Hank a card. "When they do, you'll need someone who still believes in justice." With that, he turned and left. Hank watched him go, fingers tightening around the box. He looked over his shoulder at the children, his family moving through the ruins like they belonged. And for the first time, he realized the hotel wasn't just a house with secrets. It was a shield. But only if he kept control of it. He walked back to Suite 7, locked the vault box in the wardrobe behind the false panel, and sat on the edge of the bed. The marigold wasn't just an inheritance. It was a battlefield. And tomorrow, the enemy would arrive. He could feel it in the wind. The knock came at 7:12 a.m., sharp, deliberate, like it was rehearsed. Hank froze mid-step in the hallway outside Suite 7. He could already hear the kids in the kitchen below arguing about how much syrup was too much. Sunlight cut through the cracked, stained glass window at the top of the stairs, casting fractured light across the dust-covered banister. But the knock 3 slow taps was too clean for this broken place. He moved downstairs, quickly, every step quiet, his instincts drawing taut like wire. Through the cloudy front glass, a black SUV idled in the gravel outside. A man stood at the door. Trim beard navy blazer over a cream turtleneck. Expensive. The kind of man who didn't step into places like the Marigold unless he was there to take something. Hank opened the door halfway. "Morning." The man smiled. "Mr. Whitaker, good to finally meet you. I'm Jackson Crowell. I represent the Brennan Family Holdings Trust." There it was. The name. Clean and corporate, but Hank felt the threat behind it like a knife behind a smile. "I didn't know they were still active," Hank said. Jackson chuckled. "Oh, they're very active, and very interested in what you've recently inherited." He held out a business card. It was bone-white embossed lettering. Nothing flashy, just expensive enough to make you feel small. "I'd love to talk. Privately," Jackson said. Hank didn't move. "I've got 4 kids here. You can say what you need to say in the lobby." Jackson's smile didn't waver, but his eyes cooled slightly. "Very well." Inside, Hank led him to the lounge where the furniture had been recently uncovered and dusted. Caleb glanced in from the hallway, clocked the suite, and disappeared with silent urgency. Hank knew he was going to tell the others. Jackson took a seat and crossed his legs. "I won't waste your time. You've come into possession of a property that has certain complications. There are family members with vested interests. Some legal, some less so." "Less so?" Hank asked. "Let's just say not everyone is fond of Howard's decision." Hank leaned forward, elbows on knees. "And you? Which kind are you?" Jackson didn't blink. "I'm the kind that makes problems disappear." There it was, finally, the sharp edge beneath all the polish. Hank had seen guys like him before, when debt collectors circled his doorstep back in Mobile. The kind of man who smiled while emptying your life onto the sidewalk. Howard left this place to me for a reason, Hank said. And until someone shows me otherwise, it's mine. Of course, Jackson said, still calm. But ownership and control are two different things. We're prepared to offer a buyout. Cash. Substantial. You and your children can walk away with a fresh start. Leave the mess behind. Hank laughed under his breath. If there's anything I've learned, it's this: you don't walk away from something that still remembers your name. Jackson tilted his head. You're making this harder than it has to be. I get that a lot. Jackson stood. You should think carefully. Doors only stay open for so long. I don't want your door, Hank said, standing too. I've got my own now. Jackson paused at the threshold. Then let me be clear what you found in that vault. It's not just paper and secrets. It's leverage. And leverage makes enemies. With that, he stepped out into the cold. The SUV kicked up dust and vanished down the road. By noon, the kids had gathered around the dining table with Caleb sifting through the files again. The moment Hank stepped into the room, Sophie looked up. He was from the family, wasn't he? Worse, Hank said. He was the family's lawyer. Caleb frowned. They know about the vault. They know everything, Hank said. Which means we're on a timer now. He looked over the diagrams and pages they'd been cataloging. Offshore accounts, evidence of money laundering, influence buying. Caleb had started tagging entries with sticky notes. Here, Caleb said, pointing. This name, D. Lansing. He shows up again and again. Payments, signatures, wire transfers. He's not a Brennan, but he's involved deep. Sophie checked another folder. Lansing was mayor of Blue Ridge Falls back in the 70s. If he was part of the cover-up, maybe the town still remembers. Hank's jaw tightened. Then we start asking questions. Discreetly. Later that afternoon, Hank and Caleb drove into town. The general store clerk, a woman named Patsy, was friendly until she heard the name Lansing. Her face changed. She crossed her arms. That man left a mess wherever he went. You knew him, Hank asked. Knew of him, she said. Always whisper deals, backroom politics. Nothing stuck, but everybody knew. When the marigold burned, he disappeared not long after. Hank hesitated. Did he ever come back? Patsy thought for a second. He came back once. Just long enough to make sure his name stayed out of the fire report. Back at the hotel, the wind was rising. Sophie was at the second-floor landing with Mason taping up plastic sheeting over a broken window. Rosie was playing receptionist at the front desk, using an unplugged phone to book ghost guests. As night fell, Caleb handed Hank a document. Found this in the last box. It was a notarized statement from Howard, unsigned but addressed to the state attorney general. It detailed the full extent of the Brennan Holdings corruption. Names, sums, operations. At the bottom, if anything happens to me, look to the vault. The truth is buried there beneath the ashes. Caleb looked up. If we finished this, if we signed it, updated it, it could blow everything open. Hank nodded slowly. But it'd also make us a target. They already came once, Caleb said. They'll come again. Then from outside tires on gravel. Everyone went still. Hank stood peering out the window. Not one SUV, two, lights off, engines running. Jackson hadn't come alone this time. We lock it down, Hank said. Doors, windows. Nobody opens anything unless it's me. Caleb grabbed Rosie, pulled her away from the front desk. Sophie ushered Mason upstairs. Hank stood by the front door, crowbar in hand. This wasn't about ownership anymore. It was survival. And the Marigold wasn't giving up its secrets without a fight. He stared into the dark, jaw clenched. Let them come. Because tomorrow he would stop running, and he would find out just how far the truth could burn. Rain had started to fall by morning, slow and steady, soaking the gravel road and turning the air thick with the scent of wet pine. The Marigold stood like a ship bracing for a storm, creaking softly in its bones. Hank hadn't slept again. He'd sat in the dining hall most of the night, watching the darkness through the cracked window crowbar by his side, eyes never fully blinking. The two black SUVs had parked at the edge of the drive. Headlights off, motors quiet. No one had knocked again. No one had stepped out. They were waiting. And Hank knew what that meant. He stood now in the hallway with Caleb, the old floor cold under bare feet. Sophie was upstairs, keeping Rosie and Mason busy with breakfast and books, trying to pretend none of this was happening. But they all felt it. The pressure building. The Marigold was no longer just haunted, it was hunted. Caleb pulled the curtain back an inch and peeked through. Still there, he murmured. Same guys. They're watching the house. Hank nodded. They want us scared. That's their move. Intimidate first, force a mistake. And then what Caleb asked. What if we don't make a mistake, they'll create one? Caleb swallowed hard. So what do? We flip the board. Hank stepped back from the window, grabbed his backpack, and began loading it. Flashlight gloves crowbar the binder of files from the vault. Then he slipped Howard's letter inside the front pocket, the one addressed to the state attorney general. You're going out there, Caleb asked. Not to them, Hank said. To someone who can help us. He held out a slip of paper. If anything happens to me, this is the combination to the safe I found behind the bar. Everything's inside. Dad. Listen, Hank said, gripping his son's shoulder. This isn't about a hotel. It never was. This is about legacy. Our family's name. Our future. They want us to believe we don't matter, that we can't fight back. But we're not just holding the truth, Caleb. We are the truth. Caleb blinked. That's the line. What the one Caleb said. The thing people remember. We are the truth. Hank gave a tight smile. Then let's make sure they hear it. He slipped out the back door 20 minutes later, cutting through the woods that curved behind the Marigold. The SUVs stayed parked. Their shadows didn't follow. He hiked down the old trail to the edge of town, soaking his boots in mud, ducking beneath low branches. His destination wasn't on any map. It was buried at the edge of the forest, where Blue Ridge met its border, a cabin. Inside waited someone Hank had only met once but hadn't forgotten. Pastor Elijah Bell. The door creaked open as Hank approached. Elijah stood inside with a steaming mug in hand, already dressed in boots and coat, as if he'd known Hank would come. They're watching you, Elijah said. I know. Did you open the vault? Hank stepped inside. I did. And now they want it back. Elijah gestured to a chair. Then you'll need more than hope. You'll need names, documentation, witnesses. You'll need to put this thing into the light where they can't kill it quietly. I've got that, Hank said, unzipping his bag. Ledger's letters, Howard's affidavit, even a list of wire transfers. Elijah raised an eyebrow. And you came here, why? Hank met his gaze. Because I need to know if I can trust you to get it out. The room was quiet for a long time, just the patter of rain on the tin roof and the crackle of the fire. Finally, Elijah nodded. Give me what you've got. I'll scan it, send it to the right hands. If something happens to you, it won't die with you. Hank handed him the binder. There's one more thing. A name. Lansing. He's tied to all of it. Payments. Disappearances. He was mayor when the fire happened. Elijah's expression darkened. Lansing's more than tied. He's the one who paid to have the fire buried. You think the police botched the investigation by accident? He made sure it never saw court. You knew. Elijah's voice dropped. I couldn't prove it. And Howard made me promise not to go after it unless the truth came to light again. Well, it has, Hank said. Now it's your move. Elijah took the documents and slid them into a waterproof case. I'll send these out by midnight. Anonymous leak. Major outlets. One copy goes to the state attorney general, another to the press. After that, no one can pretend it didn't happen. Good. But Hank, Elijah said, serious now. Once it's out there, they won't play soft anymore. You won't just be holding the truth, you'll be protecting it. That means they come for your kids next. Hank didn't flinch. Then I'll be ready. Back at the Marigold, Caleb had done exactly what he promised. He'd hidden the box behind the false panel in Suite 7, double-locked it, then placed Rosie's stuffed animals in front like a makeshift security detail. Sophie was checking the windows again. Mason was making a list of all the escape tunnels he planned to dig, none of which would ever work. But it kept them busy. Then the front door rattled. Not knocked. Rattled. Caleb froze. Jackson Crowell stood on the porch again, but this time he wasn't alone. A second man stepped beside him. Bald, heavy-set, leather jacket, no smile. Caleb backed away from the door. We know you're in there, Jackson called out. You've had your time to think. Now it's time to act. Sophie ran to the stairwell and hissed at Dad. Now. I can't, Caleb whispered. He's not back yet. Jackson knocked again, harder this time. You don't open this door, we'll assume you're destroying evidence. That won't go well for you, son. Mason peeked around the couch. We're totally gonna die. No one's dying, Caleb said. Just stay upstairs, all of you. He walked to the door, hand shaking only slightly. Then he locked the bolt, loud enough for them to hear it. Silence followed. Then Jackson's voice, low and sharp. You think this is your story, Caleb, but it isn't. It's a legacy written in ink and blood long before you were born. And boys who hold fire too long, they burn. Caleb didn't move, didn't answer, because he knew something they didn't. They weren't the only ones with fire. Outside town, Elijah Bell's encrypted email blinked sent. Dozens of documents, photographs, and records dispersed into the cloud. By nightfall, the story would no longer belong to the Marigold. It would belong to the world. And what was buried would finally rise. The sky turned a hard gray by late afternoon, the kind that made even time feel heavier. Clouds rolled in low and thick over the mountains, smothering the last gold streaks of sun. Hank was halfway up the muddy trail to the Marigold when he saw the black SUVs again parked closer now, like wolves circling a fire. He crouched in the trees for a moment, heart thudding, watching the silhouettes move inside. Jackson hadn't left. Neither had the other one, the quiet man in the leather jacket. There was a third now, too. Slim sunglasses even in the overcast. Armed. They weren't just there to talk anymore. Hank moved fast through the trees, ducking under branches, boots slipping in wet leaves, adrenaline sharpening every step. He reached the edge of the property and used the side path to loop around the back. When he pushed open the cellar door, Caleb was already there, waiting with a flashlight. They tried to force the front door, Caleb said quietly. Didn't get through, but they're not leaving. Where are your brother and sisters, Suite 7? Sophie's got them barricaded in. Hank exhaled. Good. You got the files out, I did, Hank said. Elijah sent them. News outlets, government contacts. They're out in the world now. Caleb's face twitched, part pride, part fear. Then it started. Yeah, Hank said. Now we see who comes out of the shadows. They stepped into the hallway as a sudden bang echoed through the hotel, a heavy blow against the front door. Caleb's eyes widened. They're trying to break in. Let them try, Hank muttered, moving fast now. Another bang! Then wood splintered. Hank motioned toward the staircase. Get the kids, move them to the vault room. Take the side stairs. I'll buy you time. Caleb hesitated. Dad, I'm not asking. Caleb ran. The front door cracked wide a second later. Jackson stepped inside, smoothing his jacket like he was walking into a boardroom instead of a war zone. Behind him came the other's leather jacket, sunglasses, silent and watching. Hank stood in the center of the lobby with his crowbar. Jackson tilted his head. Still holding out Mr. Whitaker brave, but ultimately pointless. You can turn around and walk out right now, Hank said. You might even sleep better if you do. Jackson chuckled. You think you've won just because you passed a few files to the press. You don't understand how this works. A leak's not justice. It's a spark in a storm. You think the storm cares? I don't care if it does, Hank said. I care about my family. And you brought this storm to our door. The man in the sunglasses stepped forward. Jackson held up a hand. No, let's give him one more chance. The box, the documents, the ledger. Hand them over and we walk away. No trouble for you or the kids. You get to keep your hotel, your freedom. Hell, I'll even cut you in on a settlement. Clean finish. Hank's jaw tightened. Don't insult me. Jackson sighed. So be it. The moment he gave the nod, Sunglasses Man lunged quick, military-trained. Hank sidestepped, drove the crowbar hard into his side. The man doubled over with a grunt. The guy in the leather jacket moved next, fast and brutal. Hank blocked his punch, but the second one caught him in the ribs. He staggered back into a chair, knocking it over. But the distraction was enough. Upstairs, Caleb had already moved the kids. Mason and Rosie had crawled through the laundry chute to the basement. Sophie had dragged the dresser across Suite 7's entrance. Inside the vault room, lit by a single bulb overhead, Caleb closed the false panel behind them. You okay? He asked. Mason nodded. Rosie clutched her doll. Sophie kept the flashlight steady. What now? She asked. We wait for Dad's signal, Caleb said. Then we do what he planned. In the lobby, Hank was bleeding from his lip, one eye swelling. But he was still standing. Jackson, untouched, checked his watch. Enough theatrics. Find the files. The two men began tearing through drawers, lifting floorboards, checking behind paintings. You won't find them, Hank said, breath ragged. You think hiding it buys you anything, Jackson snapped. I told you this isn't about money. It's about control, about history. You think we haven't done this before? We buried whole names, whole families. You're not special. I'm not, Hank said, lifting his eyes. But my kids are. A sudden loud noise upstairs stopped everything. A recording, playing through the hotel's old intercom system. It was Howard Brennan's voice. If you're hearing this, it means the vault has been opened and my fears have come true. Jackson froze. This isn't just about the marigold. The voice continued. It's about everyone who thought power meant erasing guilt. I kept the records. I kept the truth. And now so has my heir. Good luck stopping it now. The voice echoed down the stairwell. You arrogant old bastard, Jackson muttered, turning to his men. Shut it down. Find the speaker, but it was too late. Sophie, watching from the second floor, had already triggered the backup system, a live stream sent from her laptop straight to Elijah's server. Caleb had given her the signal. They'd launched the truth. At 8:43 p.m., social media channels lit up. Local journalists began tweeting screenshots. New York Times received a secure folder labeled The Marigold Papers. The state attorney general's office confirmed it was reviewing new evidence related to the Brennan Foundation, and the name Jackson Crowell began trending. Down in the vault, Caleb stared at the flickering monitor on Sophie's laptop. Is it working? Mason asked. Caleb watched the number of views rise. It's working. Rosie clapped once. Are we famous? Kind of, Sophie said. But mostly we're dangerous. Caleb smiled grimly. Good. Then a loud bang. Not from the front door. From below. The panel in the vault wall shifted. A breeze moved through and stone scraped against stone. Another room. Hidden deeper, Caleb's eyes widened. Guys, the vault has a vault. And just like that, everything changed again. The Marigold wasn't finished speaking. Not yet. The second vault wasn't just another room. It was a tomb. The kids stood at the threshold, flashlights trembling in their hands. The narrow passage behind the hidden panel was lined with brick damp and breathing cold. At the end of the corridor was a steel door with no knob, no visible lock, just a handprint-sized smudge in the dust. Sophie stepped forward and pressed her palm to it. Click. The door groaned open with a sound like something exhaling after years of silence. Inside, the air was thick with time. It smelled like paper and metal, and something older grief, maybe. The chamber was small, circular walls lined with safety deposit boxes and filing cabinets, most unmarked. Caleb swallowed hard. This isn't just a vault. It's a bunker. In the center of the room stood a single table. On it, a reel-to-reel tape recorder already loaded. A label had been taped to the top for my final confession. HB. Caleb looked at Sophie. She nodded slowly. He pressed play. A moment of hiss. Then Howard's voice, older and more fragile than they'd heard before. I built this room not to hide the truth, but to protect it from the wrong hands. If you've found it, I hope to God you're better than I was. He paused, took a breath. You think I was a good man? I wasn't. I let it happen. I watched the money flow in from companies that never existed, watched people disappear, paid off, buried, or worse. I wanted to stop it, but I didn't. Because I was scared. Because I liked the life too much. Because I thought legacy was something you protected, not exposed. Outside, the wind howled. Inside the tape, Howard's voice dropped. And then there was the fire. Caleb and Sophie leaned closer. I knew it was coming. I knew Lansing and the others were closing in. They thought I'd talk. So they decided to silence everything. The hotel, the records, me. They planned it to the minute. But they didn't know about this room. They didn't know I had backup copies. That I kept names and faces and, God forgive me, bodies. Caleb's breath caught. There are names on the wall, Howard continued. Real names, not initials. I carved them myself, every one of them tied to a crime, tied to a lie. If this hotel is ever to live again, it has to start with the truth. The tape ended with a click. Silence followed. Heavy, and holy. Mason, who had crept up behind them, whispered, "Did he say bodies?" Caleb nodded slowly. Sophie's flashlight scanned the back wall. There, beneath layers of dust and age, they found it names, etched into the concrete by hand. Dozens of them. Some they recognized. Some matched the ledger. And some, Caleb, Sophie said, voice shaking. "This one. Right here." She pointed. Margaret Whitaker. Their grandmother. Caleb stared. That can't be." "Look," Mason said, pulling a document from a nearby shelf. "She worked for the Brennans. She signed disbursements. She was part of it." Caleb shook his head. "No. Grandma raised Dad. Alone. She never had money. She was never part of this." "Maybe she turned," Sophie said gently. "Maybe that's why Howard marked her. Maybe she tried to stop it." They stood there for a long moment, the weight of family history pressing in like walls. Then they heard it. Footsteps. From upstairs. Fast. Heavy. More than one pair. Caleb killed the light. Sophie grabbed that recorder. Mason documents. Anything with names. They scrambled stuffing evidence into their backpacks. Caleb glanced at the steel door. It had no lock, no way to bar it. "We need to go, now." They darted back into the corridor, just as voices echoed from the vault above. They were here. Find the entrance. Leather jacket. Sunglasses. And now more. Reinforcements. The kids raced through the corridor, ducking under low beams. Mason tripped. Sophie caught him. Caleb led the way, heart pounding in his throat. They emerged into the wine cellar, slamming the trap door behind them. Upstairs, chaos. A door crashed open. Shouts. Boots stomping across old floors. Then silence. The kind that means someone is listening. Caleb motioned for quiet. One wrong move and they'd hear the creak of old wood. They'd know where to look next. Then from outside this building, tires on gravel. Loud, fast, tires skidding. A horn blared. "Hank." Caleb didn't think. He shoved the others toward the front hall. "Go." They burst into the lobby just as Hank rammed his truck into the side of the front steps, startling Jackson and his men. Dust exploded. Two of the suits ducked behind the desk. Jackson spun around, hand reaching inside his coat. Hank stepped out, shotgun in hand. "You want my hotel? Come and bleed for it." Sophie pulled Rosie behind a couch. Mason crawled under a table. Caleb met his father's eyes across the chaos and nodded once. Everything they had was in their bags. The confession, the names, the truth. Hank kept his eyes on Jackson. "You didn't think we'd find the second vault?" "Did you?" Jackson didn't reply. "You buried people for less." Hank continued. "But you forgot one thing. You don't get to rewrite history just because you can burn it." "Sunglasses," man lunged. Hank fired a warning shot. Splinters exploded from the beam overhead. That was enough. The intruders backed off. Jackson straightened his coat, adjusted his collar. "This isn't over." "It is for you," Hank said. Then headlights flooded the room, red and blue flashing. Sirens screamed. Deputies spilled out of 3 county cruisers, guns drawn. "Hands where we can see them," a voice barked. Jackson froze, slowly raised his hands. So did his men. Deputy Rhodes approached Hank. "We got a dozen calls after that live stream. Reporter from Asheville forwarded us a full dossier. We've got warrants. Federal agents on the way. He looked at the kids, their backpacks, the fear in their eyes. Y'all did good, Rhodes said. Really damn good. Hank exhaled for the first time in hours. Dad Caleb whispered, stepping beside him. There's more. Deeper. Names. Grandma's name. Hank turned, stunned. What? She was on the wall. But we think she turned against them. We think she tried to do what you're doing now. Hank stared at his son, this boy who'd grown more in a week than most men did in a year, and he felt something deep crack open inside. Pride, grief, forgiveness, all tangled together. We carry her name, Hank said quietly. But now, we get to decide what it means. Behind them, the Marigold groaned as more cars pulled up, more footsteps swarmed the porch. But inside, for the first time, it felt like the hotel had finally exhaled. Not haunted, not cursed, just ready. And what was hidden had finally been heard. The smell of burnt wood and coffee hung in the air the morning after the raid. The Marigold was quiet again, but it wasn't the kind of silence that came from fear. It was the kind that settled after something immense had cracked open. The kind of silence that follows a reckoning. Deputies had cleared out hours ago. Federal agents had begun cordoning off the second vault for evidence collection. Forensics crews would arrive later that week. They'd taken Jackson and his men into custody without incident. Charges were already being drafted: money laundering, obstruction, conspiracy, and possibly worse. But none of that felt like victory. Because even after everything they'd found, everything they'd fought through, the truth hadn't made anything easier. It had only made it real. Hank stood in the dining hall, staring out the broken window as the first light touched the mountains. Sophie was upstairs helping the kids pack their things just in case. They hadn't decided if they were staying. The authorities had advised them to lay low. Hank couldn't stop thinking about the name Caleb had said. Margaret Whitaker. His mother. Etched into the bunker wall like a scar. He couldn't shake it. Couldn't square the woman who raised him, kind, stubborn, always broke with the idea that she was once part of the machine that wrecked lives. He heard footsteps behind him. Caleb entered, eyes puffy from lack of sleep, but steady. In his hands, he held something wrapped in cloth. We found this, he said, in the second vault hidden in one of the cabinets. He unwrapped it and placed the object on the table. An old leather-bound journal. Hank picked it up gently. The initials embossed in gold, M.W. He opened it. Inside was her handwriting. Slanted. Sharp. June 3rd, 1972. They said it would just be bookkeeping. Just numbers. But today I saw my first real ledger. And I think I know this money comes from somewhere dark. Hank flipped forward. August 19th, 1973. Howard tried to warn me. He said once I took the job, they'd own me. I thought I could stay clean. I thought I could keep Hank out of it. But the deeper I go, the more I see. No one stays clean. His throat tightened. Another page. October 5th, 1974. They're talking about a purge. Howard says they want to destroy the vault. Burn the Marigold. He's building a hidden room. Says it'll be safe for the records. For the truth, I don't think I'll make it out. Hank's hands trembled as he turned the final entry. November 14th, 1974. If my name ends up on the wall, let it. Let it remind whoever finds this that I tried, that I fought, that I didn't go quiet. Hank, if you ever see this, I did everything I could to protect you. even if it meant becoming one of them to destroy them from the inside. The last line blurred as his eyes welled. Caleb was silent, just letting the moment hold. She didn't just give up, Hank whispered. She went under, played the part, to stop it from inside. Caleb nodded. That's what it looks like. And Howard knew he marked her, Caleb said, but he also protected you. That's why he left it all to you, because he knew you were the only one who could finish it. Hank closed the journal slowly. It's not finished yet, he said. Because of the other names, no, Hank said, because this place still breathes their ghosts. He looked around the marigold, at the beams, the peeling wallpaper, the cracked chandeliers. This hotel isn't just a crime scene, he said. It's a memorial, and we can't let it rot like they wanted. Caleb's brow furrowed. So, what do we do? Hank's voice hardened. We bring it back to life. By noon, they'd started clearing the vault. With federal permission, Hank had retrieved the non-sensitive documents, mostly ledgers, blueprints, and the old marigold architectural plans Howard had hidden. Mason had been the first to suggest it. We turn it into a museum, he said, mouthful of cereal, like one of those creepy Civil War houses, only with mob guys and shady ledgers. Rosie added, and ghost tours with real ghosts. Sophie had laughed at first, but Hank didn't, because it wasn't a bad idea. What if we opened the Marigold not as a hotel, Hank said, but as something more honest, a place to learn the truth, a place where history doesn't get rewritten by the loudest liar in the room. They called Elijah. He loved it. Offered to fund part of it through donations. Said he knew a few journalists who would cover the renovation. The more they talked, the more it felt possible. Not easy. Not safe. But real. And that was enough. Later that evening, Sophie and Caleb sat with Hank at the front desk, going over notes. We'll need permits, Sophie said. Restoration teams, electricians. I know a guy in Asheville, Caleb said. Restores old estates. Might do it cheap if we tell him it's for justice. Hank smirked. People like justice when it doesn't cost them too much. Just then, a knock. Not forceful, gentle. Hank opened the door. A woman in her 60s stood there. Gray hair in a neat bun. A small cross around her neck. Mr. Whitaker, she asked softly. That's me. She held out an envelope. I was Margaret Whitaker's nurse, she said. Back when she got sick. She gave me this in 1985. Said I'd know when to deliver it. Hank blinked. Why now? The woman smiled sadly. Because you made the truth louder than the lies. She turned and walked away. Hank closed the door and opened the envelope. Inside, a single note in his mother's handwriting. Hank, if this ever reaches you, it means the story outlived the silence. I was never proud of what I became, but I was always proud of you. Keep fighting. Make the Marigold mean something again. Make our name something worth saying. His hands curled around the paper, and he whispered, I will. That night the lights stayed on in the Marigold long after dark. Not out of fear, but because something new was beginning. And for the first time in half a century, the old hotel didn't feel cursed. It felt alive. The wind snapped through the empty halls of the Marigold, like a voice not quite ready to leave. Rain hit the windows in waves, making the place feel like it was floating adrift, but not sinking. Not anymore. A week had passed since the story broke. The media had swarmed the town in the beginning. Local reporters, national crews, Even a documentary team had shown up uninvited, hovering outside the property like vultures. But most of them had left now, moving on to louder scandals in shinier cities. What remained was the truth, and the mess that truth left behind. Hank stood on the roof with Caleb and Sophie watching, as a pair of electricians reconnected the old weather vane to the main grounding line. The Marigold was finally being rewired after 40 years of darkness. Generators hummed in the lot. The city had agreed to reroute utilities after the documents proved the property had been purposely disconnected as part of the cover-up. Funny Hank muttered all that power stolen by men who thought they'd never have to give it back. Caleb adjusted his cap, glancing toward the tree line. They tried, but they didn't count on one thing. "What's that?" Sophie answered without looking up us. Hank smiled faintly. "They never do." As they walked back downstairs, Hank's phone buzzed in his coat pocket. He checked the screen. A name he didn't recognize, Charlotte Anders, but the area code was from Washington, D.C. He answered. "This is Hank." A clear, calm voice replied. "Mr. Whitaker, my name is Charlotte Anders. I'm with the Department of Justice's Division of Historic Corruption Review. I've been assigned to your case." "You're about 6 decades late," Hank said. She didn't laugh. "We've received the Brennan files, everything from the first and second vaults. The scale of the evidence is staggering. The Attorney General has opened a multi-state investigation. You may be called to testify in front of Congress." "Congress?" Hank asked, stopping mid-staircase. "I'm a hotel janitor with 4 kids and a toolbox." And now Charlotte said, "You're also the whistleblower of the largest concealed financial conspiracy in Appalachian history." He leaned against the rail, absorbing that. Charlotte continued. "We'd also like to propose that the Marigold Hotel be designated a National Historic Site. Pending approval, it would receive federal funding, legal protection, and national recognition." Sophie, hearing only one side of the call, mouthed, "What's happening?" Hank just whispered, "They want to make us permanent." Charlotte added one last thing, "But with permanence comes responsibility. You'll need to finish what you started. Restoration, records, memorials. This place needs to tell the whole story, without edits. I wouldn't know how to whitewash it if I tried." Hank said. "Good," she replied. "Because from what I've read, this place doesn't need polishing. It needs remembering." By the following Monday, they started setting up the exhibit room. The old ballroom, which once hosted wealthy guests and secret meetings, would now display files, artifacts, and the complete audio confession from Howard Brennan. Sophie had drafted the narrative panels. Caleb had organized the timeline of events. Mason had made cardboard signs that read things like, "Criminal stuff here," and "No touchy-touchy." Rosie naturally had bedazzled those, but it was Sophie who noticed it first. One of the boxes from the second vault was mislabeled. It had been cataloged as Ledger 9, but was in fact a film reel. Caleb found the old projector and spent most of the afternoon fixing it. When they finally turned it on, the dusty image flickered against the ballroom wall. It was dated August 12, 1974. Howard Brennan stood in front of the camera looking 10 years younger than they remembered. At his side was a woman in a nurse's uniform, Margaret Whitaker. Caleb sat forward. "That's Grandma." She looked nervous. Her hands were folded. Howard adjusted the mic and turned to her. "State your full name." "Margaret Lynn Whitaker. Your position, financial assistant to the Brennan Foundation." Howard asked, "Why are you making this statement today?" Margaret looked down, then straight into the lens. "Because I need to tell the truth before they erase me." She reached into her coat and pulled out several documents. "These are copies of disbursement records showing illegal campaign donations, slush funds, and false charity fronts run through shell companies. Sophie's mouth dropped open. She was the original whistleblower. Hank stood frozen, watching his mother's face flicker across the wall. Margaret continued. I was told it was bookkeeping. Then I was told it was harmless. Then they stopped telling me anything. That's when I knew I was dangerous. I want my son to grow up knowing the truth, even if I disappear, even if my name gets scratched off every file. Howard's voice returned. Do you know the risks of this testimony? Yes, she whispered. But if no one speaks, it happens again. The screen cut to black. Silence followed. Then Caleb whispered what everyone was thinking. She started it all. Hank didn't speak for a long moment. Then he walked over to the wall and placed his hand on the screen where her face had been. She wasn't just a name in concrete, he said. She was the match. That night, Hank stood outside the hotel on the porch, watching the sky turn pink and blue. The storm had passed. The clouds were gone. Elijah joined him with 2 mugs of strong tea. You good? He asked. No, Hank said honestly. But I'm getting closer. They sipped in silence. Then Elijah said, You know your mom, she came to me before she made that tape, told me what she planned. I offered to hide her, but she wouldn't run. Said hiding the truth made her sick. Said the only way to break a legacy is to drag it into the light and let it scream. Hank smiled, tears threatening again. That sounds like her. Stubborn. Righteous. Elijah handed him an envelope. This came for you, from the governor's office. Hank opened it. Inside was a certificate. The Marigold Hotel has been granted status as a protected historical site. At the bottom, in honor of Margaret Whitaker, for courage in silence, for truth in darkness. Hank whispered, She's permanent now. Elijah looked out across the hills. Yeah, she is. And for the first time, Hank didn't feel the weight of her name. He felt its wings. Morning sunlight poured through the cracked, stained glass windows of the Marigold's grand foyer, casting warm shards of color across the dusty wood floor. For the first time in decades, it didn't feel haunted. It felt alive, scarred, yes, but breathing again. The kind of breath that follows a long silence and carries the weight of 1,000 unsaid things. Hank walked the hall slowly, his fingers trailing along the grooves of the wall. He stopped by the brass plaque recently installed near the stairwell. It was small, understated. Just a name, Margaret Whitaker. Silent, next to it, another Howard Brennan. The last keeper of the truth. Above them both, carved into a beam, a phrase Caleb had burned in with a soldering tool: truth doesn't rot in the dark. It waits. The words had been hard-earned. The Marigold had reopened last week, not as a hotel, not as a tourist trap, but as something between a museum and a warning. The public could walk through the halls, read the ledgers, listen to Howard's confession, and even visit the second vault, now sealed behind bulletproof glass and federal protection. The place still creaked, still groaned in storms, but it no longer carried fear, only memory. Downstairs in the kitchen, Caleb and Sophie were helping prep coffee and pastries. They'd convinced Elijah to bring in some volunteers from his church. It smelled like cinnamon and hope. Rosie had drawn little maps for visitors, and Mason had written out fun facts on index cards, most of which were factually questionable but charming all the same. Hank sat in his father's old chair in the dining hall, watching the morning guests arrive. Families, journalists, students, a class from a local high school. a veteran who had once stayed in room 6 back in 1968. Everyone came for something different, but they left with the same thing: truth. Not just about the crimes, not just about the lies, but about how easily silence grows when people look away. Charlotte Anders had visited 2 days ago. She brought more good news. Indictments were proceeding. Lansing had fled the country, but extradition was underway. Others had confessed. A few had turned themselves in, carrying guilt older than their children. But that wasn't what stuck with Hank. It was something Charlotte said before she left. This isn't just a story about corruption. It's a story about the people who refused to disappear. That's what this place had become. A reminder. A refusal. Sophie slid into the seat beside him with 2 mugs of coffee. She passed one to Hank and leaned back. "They're calling you the Ghost Keeper of Blue Ridge now," she smirked. Hank rolled his eyes. "Sounds like a B-movie title. Better than Hotel Janitor Turns Whistleblower," Caleb added, dropping into the seat across from them. Rosie followed, handing Hank a crayon drawing of the marigold with a heart above it. She had drawn herself standing on the roof in a cape. "This is me saving the hotel," she said. "You're missing the fire and the shotgun," Mason added helpfully. "That was the cool part. Let's maybe leave the shotgun out of the children's exhibit," Sophie said. They laughed. A deep, full laugh. It filled the space where tension used to live. Hank folded the drawing and tucked it into his coat pocket. "You know," he said, "I used to think this place was cursed, that my mother's name was a weight. That legacy meant carrying someone else's sins." He looked around at them, his kids, his family. "But now I think legacy is a choice. You don't carry what they gave you. You carry what you build from it." Caleb nodded slowly. "So what are we building? A future," Hank said. "One that remembers. One that tells the story right." Outside, the wind had shifted. Softer now. The kind that carries change instead of warning. As the last guests of the morning filtered in, Hank stepped up to the small stage they'd built in the center of the room, where the bar used to be back when the marigold had secrets it couldn't keep. He cleared his throat and tapped the microphone. The room quieted. "I want to thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady. "Not just because it helps keep the lights on, but because it means something more than you know." He looked out across the faces. Some young, some weathered. All of them listening. This hotel, he continued, was built on lies, on silence, on power that fed itself by taking from others. People disappeared here. Stories were erased. Names were buried. He paused, breathing in the weight. But not forever. You're here because someone kept a record. Someone made a tape. Someone carved names into concrete so they wouldn't vanish. He glanced toward the wall with the vault door, now a centerpiece, now something to teach, not fear. They tried to erase people like Howard Brennan, like Margaret Whitaker. But they failed. Because truth doesn't rot. It waits. It waits for someone willing to pick up the torch. For someone brave enough to say, "That's not how it ends." He looked at his kids, all 4 of them watching him. "And now it's our job to carry it forward, to build something honest, something better." Silence. Then applause. Not thunderous, but warm. Lasting. Later that night, after the doors closed and the lights dimmed, Hank found himself alone in the vault. He ran his fingers across the concrete where his mother's name was etched. This time it didn't hurt. It didn't sting. It glowed. He lit the candle Sophie had placed on the ledge just beside the journal they'd preserved in glass. Not as a relic, but as a reminder. because that's how you end a story like this. Not with revenge, not with shame, but with light. The Marigold had once been a place where darkness grew. Now it was a place that told the truth, and the truth finally had a home.